For a huge panorama, if I'm doing like a full arch, obviously you want to start as early as you can. So I try not to raise the camera vertically, um, and I actually learned this that night. I what I'll do is I'm peering through the viewfinder, and I just bring the horizon ever so slightly into the bottom of my view. And if I'm just going to do a one row panel, I'll keep the horizon there. If I'm going to do a multi row panel, I'll lose the horizon. I'll pull it up a little bit higher. And then I'll basically start my exposures. I start north to south. Always start north to south. I learned this again that night. If you start south to north, the core of the Milky Way will rise significantly faster in your images, and you'll have to raise your camera more vertically, and that'll create weight balance problems. If you start north to south, um, what will be nice is as you rotate your camera from exposure to exposure, the core will essentially rise into the field of view of your camera. And so you won't have to raise it vertically. And so, for me, if I'm using a 50 millimeter lens, that's going to mean about 9 exposures, 8 or 9 exposures with 33% overlap from north to south to cover 180 degrees. And so, I'll have it set to 0 on here on my pano head. I'll have my intervalometer, set the time. I have it all polar aligned. Mount is level. I'm ready to shoot. Trigger exposure, wait 2 minutes, 3 minutes, depending on how dark your skies are. Your camera settings will probably be different, but I usually use like f2.8 on my Sigma art lenses. That gets rid of all the terrible chroma that those lenses have. With my D800E, I usually use ISO 800. If you're using a Canon camera, I would use ISO 1600. And then your exposure time itself, you need to look at the histogram on the back of your camera. Don't look at the preview image on your camera. Look at the histogram. The preview image is going to be an artificially enlightened image. Your camera will process the raw shot and give you that preview as a JPEG. If you look at the histogram, you want to produce a histogram where the peak, your big peak, is about 1/3 off the left edge. So my histogram, I have it divided into thirds, and I shoot for a peak that's about 1/3. Okay, so for most cases, that's about 2 or 3 minutes at ISO 6 or 800 and f2.8. If you're shooting like f2.8 and 1600, it might only be like a minute and a half, or it might be longer if you're shooting in really dark skies, or shorter if you're shooting in light pollution. It's just there's a lot of factors, and you're gonna have to test it out before you start your pano. Okay, so you've got your settings dialed in, you've got your field of view dialed in. If you're doing just one row of sky, keep the horizon in a little bit of each picture, and then start your imaging, what you want to call it, train, I guess. If you're doing multi-rows like I did for that huge picture, like I said, I'll raise this vertically a little bit so there's no longer horizon in the sky. And then I'll start my first exposure. Like I said, after first exposure, rotate the head, a couple hash marks on my panel head, start the next one. I'll check the leveling base after the second exposure, then rotate the head, and I'll just repeat this process until I've gotten fully south. At this point, I've got the first row done. I'll switch all the way back to north. Carefully rotate your head. If you're using a ball head, it might be a good idea to check your polar alignment after the first row, just really quickly. And then again, I'll tighten this down. I'll make sure my view for the next row is slightly lower if you're only doing 2 rows, Again, in your second row, include a little bit of the horizon. It'll be blurry, but you'll want that for orientation purposes when you post process. And then again, I'll just do the same thing, exposure, rotate, and that's essentially how I do it for the sky. After I'm done with the sky, I'll turn off the tracking mount, and for the foreground, obviously it doesn't matter. You just got to crank through your exposures as quickly as you can, not having to worry about the mount rotating and stuff like that.